The silence in the NATO command center was deafening. For 3 weeks, the Alliance's top military minds had failed to find a solution. Then the sound of a young woman's voice cutting through the tension changed everything forever. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing for more tales of unrecognized heroes. The NATO Joint Operations Center in Norfolk, Virginia, hummed with the quiet tension of a crisis that had no easy answers. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen sat at the back of the massive briefing room, her notebook filled with observations that no one had bothered to ask for. At 34, she was the youngest officer in a room filled with generals whose combined military experience spanned over 4 centuries of warfare, peacekeeping, and strategic planning. The crisis had begun 3 weeks earlier when hostile forces had seized control of a critical shipping lane in the Baltic Sea, effectively cutting off vital supply routes to 3 NATO member nations. What made the situation particularly complex was that the hostile forces weren't representing any recognized government. They were a sophisticated paramilitary organization with advanced weapons, coordinated tactics, and apparent backing from sources that intelligence agencies couldn't definitively identify. General William Harrison, the American 4-star who commanded NATO's Joint Force Command, stood at the head of the room reviewing the same intelligence reports they had been analyzing for weeks. His weathered face showed the strain of sleepless nights spent trying to find a solution that wouldn't escalate into a broader conflict while still protecting alliance member nations. "Gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We're facing a situation that defies conventional military response. These forces have positioned themselves in international waters, making direct military action legally complicated. They're using advanced anti-ship missiles that make naval approaches extremely dangerous. And intelligence suggests they have backing from state actors who will deny any involvement if we escalate." Lieutenant General François Dubois, the French officer who served as Harrison's deputy, leaned forward in his chair. His 40 years of military service included combat operations in Africa, peacekeeping missions in the Balkans, and strategic planning roles throughout Europe. "Our traditional responses simply don't apply here," he said, his English carrying a slight accent. "Economic sanctions are meaningless against non-state actors. Diplomatic pressure has no target. Military force risks exactly the kind of escalation our governments want to avoid." General Klaus Müller, representing German interests, nodded grimly. His expertise in logistics and supply chain management made him acutely aware of how the shipping lane closure was affecting European economies. "The economic impact is mounting daily. Commercial shipping companies are rerouting around the blockade, adding thousands of miles to delivery routes. Food prices are rising in affected nations. Public pressure for action is increasing, but our options remain limited." Admiral James Thornton, the British naval expert, spread maritime charts across the briefing table. His career had included command of carrier battle groups and extensive experience in naval warfare. Naval approaches are effectively blocked by their missile coverage. They've positioned their assets to create overlapping fields of fire that would make any direct assault extremely costly. "We're looking at potential losses that would be politically unacceptable for what amounts to an engagement with irregular forces." Sarah listened to the discussion with growing frustration. For 3 weeks, she had watched these experienced officers apply conventional military thinking to an unconventional problem. Their approach was methodical, professional, and completely inadequate for the situation they faced. Each proposal fell into predictable categories: direct military action that risked escalation, economic measures that had no meaningful target, or diplomatic initiatives that addressed the wrong parties entirely. The problem wasn't that these officers lacked experience or intelligence. The problem was that their extensive experience had created blind spots. They were approaching a 21st century crisis with 20th century solutions, applying lessons learned from conflicts that bore little resemblance to the current situation. Colonel Michael Rodriguez, a Marine officer with extensive combat experience in urban warfare, offered his perspective. "We've considered special operations approaches, but the target profile doesn't support them. These aren't traditional military installations that can be neutralized by small teams. They're operating a distributed network of mobile platforms with sophisticated early warning systems." The discussion continued along familiar lines, with each officer contributing expertise from their particular specialty, while the overall solution remained elusive. Sarah had heard these same arguments, proposals, and concerns repeatedly over the past 3 weeks. The most experienced military minds in the Alliance were trapped in analytical patterns that prevented them from seeing alternatives. General Harrison looked around the room, his expression showing the weight of command responsibility. The Secretary General is expecting a viable action plan by tomorrow morning. NATO's credibility is at stake. If we can't respond effectively to this challenge, it raises questions about the Alliance's ability to protect member nations in an era of hybrid warfare. Lieutenant General Patricia Williams, an Air Force officer with expertise in strategic planning, spoke up. We've modeled every conventional response scenario. Military action carries unacceptable risks of escalation and civilian casualties. Economic pressure has no meaningful target. Diplomatic initiatives lack leverage over non-state actors with hidden backing. The room fell silent as the senior officers contemplated options they had already examined exhaustively. Charts covered every available surface, showing shipping routes, missile ranges, economic impact projections, and potential response scenarios. Weeks of analysis had produced comprehensive understanding of the problem, but no viable solutions. Sarah had been taking notes throughout the meeting, but they weren't notes about the discussion. Instead, she had been analyzing the problem from angles that hadn't been explored. Her background was different from the other officers in the room. While they had risen through traditional military career paths, focusing on specific specialties and conventional approaches, Sarah's experience had been more varied. She had started her career as an intelligence analyst, spending years studying non-state actors, hybrid warfare, and unconventional threats. Her master's degree in international relations had focused on the intersection between military power and economic systems. Before joining NATO staff, she had worked with interagency task forces that dealt with threats that didn't fit neatly into traditional military categories. More importantly, Sarah approached problems with what her professors had called strategic empathy, the ability to understand situations from multiple perspectives simultaneously. While the senior officers in the room were analyzing the crisis from NATO's perspective, Sarah had been considering it from the viewpoint of the hostile forces, the affected civilian populations, the supporting governments, and the broader international community. General Harrison was preparing to adjourn the meeting when Sarah cleared her throat. The sound was quiet but somehow carried across the room, causing conversations to pause and heads to turn. She had never spoken during these strategic planning sessions, had never been asked for input, and had certainly never interrupted a discussion among general officers. "Sir," Sarah said, her voice steady, despite the attention of the most senior military leadership in the Alliance. "I believe I may have identified an approach that hasn't been fully explored." The silence that followed was profound. General Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, more in surprise than disapproval. In his experience, lieutenant colonels didn't interrupt strategic planning sessions to offer alternatives that senior generals had somehow overlooked. The other officers showed varying degrees of surprise, curiosity, and skepticism. "Lieutenant Colonel Chen," Harrison said carefully, "you have something to contribute to our strategic assessment?" Sarah stood up, moving to the front of the room with calm confidence. She had spent 3 weeks preparing for this moment, knowing that her one opportunity to present an alternative approach would need to be comprehensive, compelling, and immediately actionable. "General, respectfully, I believe we've been analyzing this crisis from the wrong framework. We're treating it as a traditional military problem requiring a military solution. But the hostile forces aren't trying to achieve military objectives. They're trying to achieve economic and political objectives using military means." Lieutenant General Dubois looked skeptical. "Lieutenant Colonel, we're well aware of the economic dimensions of this crisis. That awareness hasn't produced viable response options." Sarah moved to the maritime charts, pointing to specific locations. "Sir, with respect, I think we've been focusing on the wrong economic dimensions. We've been analyzing the impact of the shipping lane closure on affected economies, but we haven't analyzed the economic model that makes the operation profitable for the hostile forces." She began drawing connections on the chart, linking shipping routes, port facilities, and economic data in ways that hadn't been visualized before. These forces aren't operating as a military unit. They're operating as a business. They've invested heavily in advanced weapons systems, maintaining operational security, and sophisticated logistics. That investment only makes sense if they're generating revenue streams that justify the costs. General Mueller leaned forward, his expertise in logistics making him particularly interested in Sarah's analysis. What kind of revenue streams? Sarah pulled out her notebook, revealing weeks of research into shipping patterns, insurance rates, and commodity pricing. They're not just blocking shipping lanes, sir. They're creating artificial scarcity in specific commodity markets, while simultaneously offering alternative shipping routes through ports they control or influence. Every ship they turn away from the direct route represents increased profits for facilities they have financial interests in. The room was completely quiet now, with senior officers recognizing that Sarah was presenting an analysis that none of them had considered. Her approach revealed the crisis not as a military challenge, but as a sophisticated economic manipulation, using military tools. Furthermore, Sarah continued, their operations are funded through a complex network of shell companies, commodity trades, and insurance schemes that actually profit from the disruption they're creating. They're not trying to achieve political objectives through economic pressure. They're achieving economic objectives through the appearance of political action. Admiral Thornton studied the charts with new interest. If you're correct, Lieutenant Colonel, then traditional military responses would actually increase their profitability by driving up insurance rates and shipping costs. Exactly, sir. Military action validates their business model. Economic sanctions target the wrong entities. Diplomatic pressure addresses political motivations that don't actually exist. We've been trying to solve a criminal enterprise problem with military strategies. General Harrison moved closer to examine Sarah's analysis. What are you proposing, Colonel? Sarah spread additional charts across the table, revealing connections between financial networks, shipping companies, and commodity markets that had taken her weeks to research. We treat this as a financial crime investigation rather than a military crisis. We trace the money flows, identify the beneficial ownership of the companies profiting from the disruption, and target the economic infrastructure that makes the operation profitable. She pointed to specific locations on multiple charts. Instead of trying to sink their ships, we freeze the bank accounts that pay for their fuel. Instead of bombing their installations, we revoke the business licenses of companies in their supply chain. Instead of engaging their military assets, we collapse the economic model that funds their operations. Lieutenant General Williams, whose strategic planning experience made her appreciate innovative approaches, began seeing the implications. That would require coordinated action across multiple governments, regulatory agencies, and financial institutions. Yes, ma'am. But NATO has the political relationships and intelligence capabilities to coordinate that kind of response. And unlike military action, economic warfare doesn't risk escalation or civilian casualties. It simply makes their business model unprofitable. General Harrison studied Sarah's analysis for several minutes, his expression shifting from skepticism to growing interest. Colonel, this approach would represent a completely different type of NATO response. We'd be acting more like an international law enforcement agency than a military alliance. Sir, the threats we face in the 21st century don't always fit traditional military categories. Hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, economic manipulation. These challenges require hybrid responses that combine military capabilities with law enforcement tools, economic analysis, and regulatory coordination. Colonel Rodriguez, despite his initial skepticism, was beginning to see the potential. The legal framework would be completely different. Instead of rules of engagement, we'd be working within international financial regulations and anti-money laundering statutes. Sarah nodded. Which gives us much more freedom of action, sir. Military responses are constrained by international law governing armed conflict. Financial investigations operate under different legal authorities with broader scope for international cooperation. The senior officers spent the next hour examining Sarah's analysis in detail. Her research was comprehensive, identifying specific companies, individuals, and financial mechanisms that supported the hostile operations. More importantly, she had identified legal authorities and regulatory tools that could be used to disrupt those financial networks. General Harrison finally looked up from the charts. Colonel Chen, how long would it take to implement this approach? Sir, I've already prepared preliminary coordination requests for financial intelligence agencies in allied nations. We could begin freezing suspect accounts within 48 hours. Supply chain disruption could begin within a week. Complete economic isolation of the operation could be achieved within 30 days. The transformation in the room was remarkable. Officers who had been frustrated by weeks of unsuccessful conventional analysis were now energized by an approach that offered genuine prospects for success. The problem that had seemed intractable under military analysis became manageable when viewed through economic and legal frameworks. Lieutenant General Dubois was the first to voice what others were thinking. "General Harrison, I believe Colonel Chen has identified the solution we've been looking for. This approach addresses the root cause rather than just the symptoms." General Mueller, whose concerns about economic impact had driven much of the urgency, was equally impressed. "The beauty of this approach is that it doesn't just resolve the immediate crisis. It creates precedents and capabilities for addressing similar threats in the future." Admiral Thornton, despite his initial focus on naval solutions, recognized the strategic superiority of Sarah's proposal. Military responses would have required months of planning and carried significant risks. This approach could be implemented immediately with minimal risk of escalation. General Harrison made his decision. "Colonel Chen, I'm authorizing immediate implementation of your proposed response plan. You'll coordinate with our political leadership, intelligence agencies, and allied financial authorities. This operation has priority classification and unlimited resource authorization." Sarah felt a surge of professional satisfaction, but she maintained her composure. "Thank you, sir. I'll begin coordination immediately." As the meeting adjourned, the other officers approached Sarah with a mixture of respect and curiosity. These were individuals with decades of military experience who had just witnessed a fundamental shift in how alliance threats could be addressed. Colonel Rodriguez spoke for many of them. "Colonel, that was brilliant analysis. How did you see connections that the rest of us missed?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. "Sir, I think sometimes experience can create assumptions about what kinds of solutions are possible. I approached this problem without preconceptions about military responses because I don't have extensive combat experience. That inexperience allowed me to see economic and legal options that might not have been obvious to officers with more traditional military backgrounds." Over the following weeks, Sarah's approach proved remarkably effective. Coordinated financial investigations rapidly identified the true beneficiaries of the shipping lane disruption. Bank accounts worth over $2.3 billion were frozen across 17 countries. Business licenses were revoked for 47 companies in the operations supply chain. Insurance policies covering their equipment were canceled, and fuel suppliers terminated contracts under regulatory pressure. The hostile forces, suddenly unable to pay their personnel or maintain their equipment, found their sophisticated operation crumbling from within. Mercenaries abandoned their posts when paychecks stopped arriving. Advanced weapons systems became useless without maintenance contracts. Communication networks went dark when service providers severed connections to avoid regulatory penalties. Within 30 days, the hostile forces abandoned their positions and dispersed, their economic model having been completely undermined. The shipping lanes reopened without a single shot being fired, without civilian casualties, and without the political complications that military action would have created. Commercial shipping resumed immediately, and commodity prices stabilized within days. But Sarah's success had implications that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. NATO Secretary General Andreas Pedersen personally commended her innovative approach during a special briefing to member nation ambassadors. "Colonel Chen has demonstrated that 21st century threats require 21st century solutions," he announced. "Her methodology represents the future of alliance security." The success story spread rapidly through international military and intelligence communities. The U.S. Treasury Department requested detailed briefings on Sarah's financial analysis techniques. The European Union's Financial Crimes Unit asked for cooperation protocols. Intelligence agencies from allied nations sought training on economic warfare methodologies. Sarah found herself presenting her approach to audiences that included finance ministers, central bank governors, and regulatory agency directors. The quiet lieutenant colonel who had sat silently in briefing rooms was now addressing the highest levels of international government and financial leadership. NATO developed new capabilities for addressing hybrid threats that combine military, economic, and legal tools. The alliance established the Economic Security Division, with Sarah appointed as its founding director. Her small team grew to include financial analysts, regulatory experts, cyber warfare specialists, and intelligence officers from multiple nations. General Harrison, reflecting on the crisis months later, acknowledged the broader lesson. "We had assumed that military experience was the primary qualification for strategic thinking. Colonel Chen proved that diverse expertise, intelligence analysis, international relations, economic understanding, can be equally valuable. Sometimes the fresh perspective is more important than extensive experience. The approach Sarah pioneered became known as integrated response strategy, combining traditional military capabilities with economic, legal, and regulatory tools. NATO began recruiting officers with backgrounds in finance, international law, and economic analysis alongside conventional military specialists. Sarah was promoted to full colonel and later to brigadier general, eventually becoming NATO's youngest division commander. But she never forgot the lesson of that day in Norfolk, that the most important contributions often come from voices that haven't been heard, perspectives that haven't been considered, and approaches that haven't been tried. Years later, when training new officers in strategic thinking, Sarah would tell them, "Experience teaches us what has worked before. Innovation teaches us what might work next. The most effective strategies combine both, but sometimes the newest voice in the room sees possibilities that experience has taught us to overlook." The crisis that had threatened to paralyze the alliance instead became a turning point, proving that the most effective solutions sometimes come from the voices that are heard least often. And Sarah Chen, the young lieutenant colonel who had dared to speak up when silence seemed safer, became proof that age and experience don't always determine who has the best answers. Her success inspired a new generation of military officers to approach problems with creativity rather than convention, to question assumptions rather than accept them, and to remember that in a rapidly changing world, the most valuable asset might not be what you know but how you think.